Hello and welcome back. Today I'm painting an atmospheric beach and it's got a nice mackerel sky which you get on a lovely summer's day. So I'm going to start with making the top right corner quite dark and have the clouds centering about there just to give a point of interest. I've mixed up the paint in advance just to give me a bit of a start. I'm just filling a big area of sky there. And then the other side, there's more of a haze. So I'm going in with slightly lighter, warmer blue. So I'm now getting the lighter, warmer colour again and going in underneath the dark colour, just very gently. Lost and found edges. And then in the middle, just putting in a line of water so the paint will not land there so heavily. And again, it's a little hint of clouds just there. I'm going to go back with a smaller brush now. That was a size 8. Add a little bit of interest around the water. Now, the water's a job to see when you're painting, but it just makes the paint find a natural edge. Just do it slowly and feather the paint out each time. And it gets much lighter down towards the cliffs. So just dropping some more in. And there's some water here and some of the paper's dry, so it's just going over the two. And then in the middle, you often get a change of cloud at the seaside where the land stops. Sort of different thermals going up. Just drop it all in, going side to side at the moment. But I need to put something in because otherwise the white waves won't show. So I'm going back to the bigger brush, just using very reduced strength paint, almost as though you'd say slightly tinted water, around the rocks and all the way to the headland. And I've got a line of foam here and then dry sand. So what I'm going to do is mix up some raw sienna, which is a bit darker than yellow ochre, and then I'm just going to add a tiny bit of Alizarin Crimson to it, because often the sand at the seaside isn't orange, it can be biscuit coloured. So I'm just going to drop that in so that it's nice and strong and up to the foamy line. You can do this with a big brush, but you just have to change the angle and go more towards the point. And then the sand isn't the same colour all along, so I'm going to go back to the raw sienna, just add a little bit in there just to get some variety. And then in the middle, just mix the colours together. It's a solid area, so I want to try and get rid of any areas of white paper that's showing. Both these coloured areas lead you to the middle, which is more complex. And there's a lot of standing water on the beach, which is slightly more purpley. Some cobalt violet, and just dropping it down as thin as I can and adding a little bit of the sky colour to it. If you try and use the colours in more than one area, it gives a picture harmony. I've got enough there, so I'm just going to use the water to move the paint I've already put down. Because it's different colours in different places, it gives the picture a little bit more interest. This is a very easy picture because there's hardly any drawing involved. And it's just areas of colour that complement each other. I've got people going surfing and people paddling, but I've got simple views of them. You don't actually have to put much in to show it's a person. And then at the front, the sand colour is more dominant again. So I'm going to go up to the area where the children are, just with raw sienna, and just put it in very gently. And if it drifts into the area that's purpley, it doesn't matter, it all adds to the effect. And I'm carrying on with the same paint, but I will tint it to the left because there's a different degree of reflection from the hillside. Having let the sky dry, I'm just going to highlight it a little bit at the top and the middle, just to make the delicate clouds that are hardly formed show a little bit more. Now, this is rag paper. If you're doing it on a flatter paper, you'll have to be more subtle, perhaps use a paint slightly more diluted, but on rag paper the paint soaks in quite quickly so that you get a paler finish at times. For the cliffs I'm using homemade grey, which will balance nicely with the other colours. And then go up from sea level, just very gently, around the waves, just pushing it back with my finger. And then I've got a darker cliff here, but what I'm going to do so it still shows is just put the grey on first and then I'll tint it, but I want it to harmonise, don't want it to clash or stand out. A few lines of rocks going down in between grass, so this actually comes up to quite a triangle, and then there's an area of rock just a little bit at the bottom, just looking for anything that's slightly rocky. So I'm moving to a smaller brush, so I'm going to mix up some Paynes grey for the wetsuits, and I'm just going to add a little bit of indigo to it to keep the blue theme through. Now I've got somebody cuddling a surfboard and somebody holding one, so I'm going to put on the nearest person first. And they've got an arm round the surfboard and then going up to their shoulders and their head. Then the other chap is the other side of the surfboard, and the surfboard's so big it's covering the rest of him, but I might put a few more lines on in a minute. Now I've got a child sitting in the surf who's got dark trunks on. I put those in, and then a little girl in a light costume. So what I need to do is to put some arms and legs in first. So I'm going to use a little bit Viridian Crimson in yellow ochre, just to separate it from the sand colour, and just put some shapes in. And I can do the same with a person sitting down. One yellow surfboard and one white surfboard. So I'm just going to put the yellow one in. Point right on it. And the white one, I'm just going to make it slightly off-white. I don't think it is actually white, but I need to separate it from the white water. So I'll just put a very light area on. So I can now go back to the hillside, and I need a green that's not going to leap forward. I need a green that's going to go back. So I'm going to use a blue as a basis for it, and a little bit of yellow ochre, and then some chrome yellow. Just stir them all around a bit until I get a subdued green. I'm going to start at the cliffs and work up. So I've got one cliff that's, the grass is very brave, it's nearly got all the way to the sea. And then there's some stone and another one that goes all the way around the darker cliff, and that comes to a point. I'm just putting in rough shapes for now, and then where it meets the cliff here, very jagged edges are required, where the grass is just hanging on, letting it skip over the paper. And I need a few more jagged edges, make it a little bit more random. So I can come back to the first cliff and put in a brown to show that it's very dark, but I'm going to tint the blue and brown together, using the blue because I've already got it in the picture, and then put in, it's like a wedge of rock that's sticking out. Just put it in. I need a curly edge because the surf's licking up against it, and I'll drop some brighter colours in. So I'll drop a little bit of the brown without the blue, and just let it find its own way down, and just add some blue at the bottom. That separated them quite nicely. By putting the blue at the bottom of the brown, they're just separating slightly, and it makes it look like there's water being flicked up there. I've got two rocks on the horizon to put in now. You know, they're grey at the bottom but brown at the top, but they're hardly visible. So I'll start with the homemade grey and get the shape, and they're quite conical. And there's another one just by the end of the surfboard. I'll put that one in as well. And then some rocks on the end of the cliff here. It's got a little ledge. I'll just put that in and just bring it back away from the edge and take the rock over the grass at the top just to make a silhouette. I'm doing this in a small brush because it needs to be subtle, not dominant. So I'll leave that like that and then go back to this big gap here, which is a lot of brown. So I'm going to go back to the brown I made for this area, but more diluted. And it goes right up to a point. And there's another area that's sort of like a half moon. I'm just putting those in gently and then dropping paint in to make them darker. And it goes around the ragged edge, so I'm just using the end of the brush just to do little stipples and pull the strokes down to the water. Just leave little marks. And I'm going back to slightly more grey. There's a ridge of rock. It might have been an old wall or something there. And just get the brush and just lose the edge a bit so it's not dominant. I need to make a very dark turquoise, which will make the sky look lighter. So I now need a bigger brush. So I'm going to use the rigger, but you needn't use a rigger. You could use any brush that you've got. Just make the paint a bit stronger and just go in very gently. And then the waves are actually over the horizon, just a little bit. You don't have to put every wave in, but I'm trying to make it interesting. And a lovely memory of a nice day on that beach with the family. And it gets slightly lighter this side, but I'm going to go in with the same colour to start with and then change it. So now going in with some turquoise and just bringing the colour forward. I can tint it in a minute, but I need to get it in there. And because there's so much white surf, this will be very visible. And slightly lighter on that side. And it gets a little bit green towards the rocks because it's not getting so much direct sunlight. So I'm just adding a little bit of Viridian to it and bringing it forward. I can move back to the rocks over here on the left that need a little bit more tinting, and they're brown at the top and then they go back down to grey. I'm just putting some brown in right against the grass line, using a bigger brush just to move it around a little bit, and then the grey comes up from the waves again. So I can now go back on top with a slightly brighter green, only slightly brighter, so I'm adding some chrome yellow and just doing it in the shape of the cliff, coming down in curves. So the next stage I can work on the wet sand. Now over here behind the surfers it's actually quite blue, so what I'm going to do is put in a blue line where the white wave finishes, just to show a shadow on the beach. Then get the brush, just let it down so that I've got a grey line, and the sand from the surface actually comes a little bit further to the left, but over on the right there's quite an orangey line where there's wet sand being thrown up, and just make a darker line, all the sand landing on the beach. That'll make the white look much brighter. It doesn't go all the way along, it's just a little bit. Then the other side of the little boy sitting down, it's more green. So I'm going to add a little bit of Viridian to my mix and just put a green line in, and then I'll bleed that out so it's not so visible. All these different colours make it a more interesting picture. The idea is it leads you in. Having let the sky dry, I'm now moving forward to the waves, which need a very dark colour but only in a thin area. So I've mixed up some Viridian and French ultramarine, and I've got a size 1 brush, and I'm just going to put in little lines to show where the waves are breaking. It's curling over, and in the middle they're quite confused, and then coming forward they're more milky because they picked up sand. So I'm adding some Naples yellow just to a corner of the mix to show that it's a different colour. And I've got several different areas where the waves are just coming in thick and fast. I can put in some reflected water where the sand are just picking up the sky colour because it's all wet. And again, that's not a pure colour. It's got all sorts of reflections and other things going on, water bouncing in several directions. So I'm just making it nice and light and concentrating on one little area at a time because it changes as the sun and the clouds move over the beach. So I've taken it to the first child and take it round her just gently, and then almost to a point by the surfers. It's narrowing down. So the next stage is to move back. There's a shadow under all the waves and they're changing direction. So I'm going to take a brush with some sandy green on with the Naples yellow and just move in towards the child and just give an indication of another wave. And they're overlapping there. And then I continue along. There's a dark line under the next wave as it's landing. So I'm just going to add some blue and green together and just put in a dark line. Just a thin one, just to show where the next wave is breaking on the beach. But a little line just gives a good highlight. Just gives more contrast between one wave and another. And then where there's sandy water is almost a dark line behind the wave. So the sand's in front and the water's getting a moment's shadow behind. So I'm just going to put that in and then use a clean brush just to move it further out. Give it a lost edge at the back. Leave it hard at the hard edge at the front. So I'm moving on with a small brush with the milky green again to a wave that's breaking here, and it's just got little areas that are a tiny bit green. Just put them on and then take some of the paint off with my finger. And then coming forward is a big area of splash, but little areas around it I can put in and then loosen the edge of that again. Only way that you can tell that the waves are splashing up the rock is because it's very dark behind them. So I need to go in with a much darker brown. So I'm going to use some indigo and burnt umber and make a dark brown and just put a tiny line behind the wave that's rolling in. And then take it up a little bit, changing to another brush, just pulling the paint up from the wave. And then in front it's got different light on it and it's not quite so dark, but the wave's still apparent. So it's peaking and then rolling into a big dip. So I'll just put the big dip in and then a few more dark streaks, which I'll do with the number 1 brush. And I don't want it coming over the grass on the cliff, so I'm just going to move it off this area that's green. And then it needs to be a little bit dark here again just to show the force of the water. And on the edge of the cliff. It's very jagged at one point, so I'm just going to use a little brush and just put some little jagged marks in. Now you can see the sweep of wave all the way across now. So by the surfers there's a very dark line. It's always good to have something to map it off against. Now I need to just move those marks out a little bit. I'm going to use a flat brush. Just pull them back a little bit and then get a number 1 brush and just go in behind them where it's much darker. So I'm going to add a tiny bit of indigo. It's in shade of the cliff now, not getting so much sunshine on it. I've just put a few more lines on and I'm letting them dry. The way that I want you to look into the picture, I need to make the edges of the beach darker and a light reflective bit of the clouds in the middle. So I'm going to use purpley blue on the right hand side and a grey blue on the left hand side, and just put the sand in. I'm using a big brush to do this and it's just floating, the water's floating over the sand, but there's a slight reflection of the sky. Just adding some more French ultramarine in. It's a reflection of this part of the sky in, and then just feathering it off. I'm going to use plain water just to bring the brush in and lose the edge. Just sweeping the brush across, making sure that I've covered everything as water would. And then from this side I'm just going to add some homemade grey to the blue. Just bring it in from the other side where it's in shade. Big streaks towards the middle. And again breaking it up with some blue, slightly warmer blue. Dilute it, walk it all the way into the middle. using a big flat brush this time, just go across the paper and pull some of the paint back so that I've got the lighter area, and I want a tiny bit that's darker. So I'm just going to get some French ultramarine, just drop that in sort of a triangle, just lose the edges. So you're now led nicely into the picture. Some of the sand is very wet and in shadow by this first wave, so I'm just going to go in with some burnt sienna and then use a clean brush and just pull it back a fraction. And that in fact goes all the way across to nearly the surface where there's a wave breaking the line. Clean brush, just lose the edge gently, taking the brush up to a steeper angle, and it makes the picture look much warmer. Now I'm just going to take some of this back a fraction because it changes colour. So I'm going to go back to yellow ochre, and just as the water recedes, it sort of goes in streaks. I'm just going to put some streaks in, just very minimal, and they go all the way behind the surface. Let's lose this little bit, make it more subtle. Now I've got to let that dry for a moment, and then I can proceed with other highlights, like some of the sand's a little bit darker here. So I'm now going back looking for more things that are easy to identify. Now there's a crest of a wave just at the end of the surfboard, which is quite handy. So I'm putting that in one line, and then I'm returning with something tiny bit darker and just adding a wiggle, because obviously the water doesn't all come down at the same rate, make it look a bit more natural. And then over here, a little hump where one wave's starting and another one's finishing, and then go in again with another line going in the middle. They're all a little bit breaking up and messy, so I can go across, and there's a much bigger wave, so it's got a more varied landing. So I'm just doing some up and down strokes to show that it's bigger, and I'm going to go back and go over them all to flatten them a bit. I've just been round and put a few more detailed reflections on, and the girl's costume. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video and you'll get to Perranporth Beach yourself. It's a lovely place for a long walk, and thank you very much for watching.